feel like some of you are really, really far away. And I'm going to get really close to the microphone because Lacey let me know that I'll get hollered at if I'm not close to it. That is verbatim what she said. We're here today because of what's on the screen right now. We're here because of water. We wouldn't be here if we weren't concerned about water. If this was just about rocks and what rocks grow up to be, I don't think we'd have all of you in this room. Water is key to our identity as Minnesotans. As Lacey mentioned, I'm regional, so I live in the Little Fork watershed, so same Rainy River watershed, but to the west of you. I live in Side Lake, tiny, tiny little town. If anybody knows it, it's because McCarthy Beach State Park is there. Ely's amazing, but we still have a better beach. Sorry, I had to. I was a township supervisor. I'm allowed to feel pride in where I live. But I do live in the Little Fork watershed now, but I haven't always. So in these photos are places I've called home before, except there is one photo from Crane Lake, which I didn't get to call home, but it's just a really cool spot, so I included it. Water has always been a key part of my life. I've always grown up in a region where water was central to our being. So in the top center, you can see Jay Cook State Park. How many folks recognize that image from the swinging bridge? Yep, so St. Louis River watershed. And we have a couple photos from Side Lake. We have one of Duluth with Lake Superior watershed. There were actually people surfing that day. I was not one of them. Rachel, do you remember that day? We were on the beach applauding the people who were crazy to be surfing. But without this water in our state and without clean water, we aren't Minnesota. And so when I went to school, I wanted to learn more about our water. So as Lacey mentioned, I went to school for water resources science and really, really did not expect to be working in mining someday with that degree. In fact, I very much expected to be working against mining with that degree because I did not see how the two things could coexist. And then I moved to the Iron Range. And the Iron Range had really large open pits. And the Iron Range had hills that I did not understand why they looked like wedding cakes. And I did not understand why no one cared about the mini earthquakes we seemed to have. And I just didn't know. I grew up in a little town called Moose Lake. I know you have your Moose Lake, ours is just a town, and our lake weirdly was actually named Moosehead Lake. So why that's not the name of the town, I don't know. But we didn't have mining. We had sand and gravel pits. We are known as the agate capital, and we do have amazing quantities of agates to the point where our pits have to be blocked off, trespassers warned to not pick agates. And I didn't know anything about mining. And I moved up here because I studied the two little lakes that are in the town of Virginia, Bailey's and Silver Lake, trying to understand why they were eutrophic. Why did they have high amounts of algae, high amounts of macrophytes? It turns out they didn't actually have high amounts. It's just that so many people on the range are so used to pit lakes that when a lake has a normal amount of weeds, they think it's not normal. But I did learn that it was actually because of stormwater, but that's a whole different story. So I didn't know anything about mining, and I needed a job, to be perfectly blunt. And I went to work for a consulting firm in Virginia and found myself working on mining projects. And I was deeply uncomfortable with that because I still did not understand that I was the reason that mining existed. To me, these holes in the ground just were there. They just dug up stuff. I didn't understand where that stuff went. I didn't understand what those taconite pellets were used for. All I saw was what I thought was just land destruction and movement of the earth. We'll come back to that. Minnesota is more than just iron. We are the 5th largest mining state in the nation because of our iron mining. And folks in my neck of the woods, we are deeply proud of what we contribute. It's cool to work at a taconite mine, watch the pellets roll out, and know that they are going to become something that people use. When I walk through a parking lot, all I see are taconite pellets, just shaped like cars. 85% of our domestic steel comes from the Iron Range. So those big open pits that all I saw was destruction, I never realized that those were actually for a use. Mining wasn't being done to us. Mining was being done for us, but I didn't see that at first. And that was something I really wrestled with. Because I liked having a car, and I liked having steel in bridges, in big buildings, and all of the things steel gets used for. But I was still kind of uncomfortable with where it came from. And I'm deeply grateful that I moved to the range and had to learn that. Had I never moved up here, I still probably wouldn't realize that. And I wouldn't realize that Minnesota is more than iron. We have the resources that you're all here because of today. We have the copper, nickel, cobalt, platinum, palladium, gold, silver. We also have titanium and vanadium, and we weirdly also have helium, because why not? Just filling up the periodic table. But we have all those things, which is good. For the simple fact that we are having to have these conversations. People around this country, last week I was in New York City, and you look around New York City and all you see are these massive skyscrapers, partly built with Iron Range iron, built with metals that come from somewhere, powered with copper that came from multiple places around the earth. And so many of those folks in New York City never have to have a conversation about where there is a hole in the ground to have built their city. They don't have to. They just live, they go about their lives. Having the resources here in Minnesota has forced us to have really hard conversations. It has forced us to have to look at ourselves and look at our consumerism and hopefully be a little uncomfortable with it. When I was getting ready to come here today and I was going through my closet trying to figure out what to wear, one of the things I was thinking about is, just where my clothes come from. If I asked all of you to take off everything not made in the US right now, the cops would show up. We are really comfortable not asking where our stuff comes from. We're really comfortable not asking who made our stuff, what conditions they made our stuff. Where was this cotton grown? I don't know. I haven't had to care. I'm an American. I just get my stuff. We are having to talk about things like copper and nickel because we have it here. And the conversations often do get heated because we love our stuff, but we love our water more and we're scared. It's easy for me to remember back to when I was 24 years old and moved to the range and thinking about mining and thinking about all it does and hearing whispers and working on one of the baseline studies for one of the proposed copper nickel mines. And I felt fear. And that fear is fair. We should be asking how we mine. We should be asking who does the mining. I'm glad we all have to be a little uncomfortable with it. Because too many people, especially those in big cities, no shade to them, but they don't have to think about it. They don't live in places where they overlook Miners Lake or where they see hills that are weirdly shaped. So my apologies to folks in the way back. This is northeastern Minnesota. And I need to update this map, and I'll explain why in a second. But in Minnesota, we didn't get to choose what our story is. Our story was chosen for us 2 billion years ago. 2 billion years ago when we finally got enough oxygen in the waters to cause the iron to precipitate out. So half of the Earth's lifetime ago, our iron resources were laid down. It's kind of astounding. And 1 billion years later, the Duluth complex was formed. And so we're having conversations today about resources that formed a billion years ago. And in 2025, we're facing the conversation about what we do with them, if anything. We get to be at a critical point in our history where we're going to talk about these things. And that conversation probably isn't going to go away ever, nor should it. So I won't go into too much depth because I just realized this map is really hard to see for even probably people in the front row. But we live in a unique area where our iron resources and our copper nickel resources actually are stacked on top of each other in one area. These are resources that people around the globe would love to have, and we somehow got both, which means we also got a responsibility. The ore is there, the metals are there, so is the water, so is the land, so are the people. How do we navigate that? And it's coming more to a head. And we are a nonpartisan organization. Oops, sorry, I just whacked my microphone. My apologies to people on Zoom who probably just got blasted with a thwap. We are a nonpartisan organization, and so I will not be venturing into politics today. But I will say that Minnesota has committed to 100% clean energy by 2040. We know that just as our iron's not enough to meet all of our steel needs in this country, and 100% clean energy in Minnesota won't stop climate change, but we do our part. And as we look at that energy transition here in Minnesota, we have to think bigger than us. Because it's really easy to be Minnesota-centric. I mean, it's actually in the name of the organization I work for. But there is an entire country beyond us, and there's an entire world beyond that. And it's a world where almost 1 billion people don't have any electricity. I looked at a study recently that talked about how much copper would need to be mined just to maintain status quo, just to keep the economy going as is. And then they added in what it'll take to actually electrify developing countries. And it's a lot. And our challenge is that we got to where we are in the US by burning coal. We got to where we are in the US using petroleum, using fossil fuels. It got us our high quality of life. Many of you today are probably wearing petroleum. Do you have any nylon on you? If you use any plastic. And so when we look at developing countries and they want to electrify, what do we want them electrifying with? Do we want them to use coal like we did? Or do we want to help them skip over that step? It's weird sometimes to even think about those conversations when I live tucked away in northeastern Minnesota. But our resources are a part of that global conversation. It was one of the coolest things about going to work for a taconite mine was to realize that I could live in a little town of 600 that nobody knows about and work for a company that was involved in a global conversation. It's not something I ever expected. Wow, you really are not going to be able to see that. So we'll just walk through it. Americans like energy. We use a gluttonous amount of energy because for the most part, it's always been really affordable. It's reliable. And we've just adapted our lives to need it. And we've relied heavily on coal. Then we transitioned to natural gas, but we still use coal. And now we're looking at transitioning away from that, and it's a first generation transition. And so from top to bottom is natural gas, coal, nuclear, solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. and it's how many metals are used. And it's this first generation build out, and it's this whole concept of Americans are not going to want a hiccup in our electricity. We all lived through COVID. We saw what happened when there was any scarcity. People lost their minds. People were hoarding toilet paper. You couldn't find bread in the stores. My husband thought he was really funny. So I was going through chemo in 2020. So my husband had to do all the shopping, which, oh my God, that was a nightmare. And him doing the shopping, chemo seemed actually pretty easy. But how big of top potato do we need? The biggest one. But he sent me a photo. He said, what kind of bread did you say you wanted? And he sent it because the entire bread shelf at Super One was empty. And so we know people don't do well with scarcity. And so as we make an energy transition, we know that we're going to need energy along the way. And we know we're going to need to build out ahead of time to make sure that once the coal shuts off, that everything else is already on. And those solar panels take metals. Just the way things are. Things are made out of stuff. Those windows over there are made out of glass that was made out of sand that was mined somewhere. The windows themselves are constructed with wood that came from trees that, probably Canada. The gypsum in our ceiling tiles, the steel, stainless steel, probably in those sprinkler heads, they all come from somewhere. So when we build solar farms, we know they had to come from somewhere. And they had to be built with something. And the same with wind. They don't exist right now, so we need to build them. What will we build them with? And will we have harmed the earth more in doing so than the benefit we will get from switching to renewable energies? That's the hard thing. I want us to feel that friction a little. I want us to realize there is always a cost to energy beyond what you pay in an electric bill. That's not the cost of electricity. The cost of electricity is what land did you take up with solar panels or windmills? Where were the mines? Where were the oil rigs that produced the petroleum that made the plastic on the cables? Don't always know. And then we have to get the power to us. For the most part, we use aluminum, aluminium if you're in Britain. Most of our power lines are going to be aluminum. It doesn't carry electricity as well as copper, but it is cheaper. But at every substation, we see copper. And we have to basically double how many transmission lines are in our country, or world, excuse me. Because when we go to replace some of these coal burning power plants, we're not putting up solar panels right there. You need more solar panels by square footage than that coal plant took. So where are the transmission lines coming and going from? Whose land are those on? And I'm not saying the energy transition is not worth it, because I 100% think it is. But let's always ask ourselves, what is that cost of that electricity? Because it's not just about what you pay on your power bill. It is land. It is water crossings. And it's mining. I throw this one up there. How many, I'm really curious on this audience. How many folks have electric cars? Okay, come on, really? I expected way more hands to go up on this. Lesson learned, Lucas. I drive a little Camry, and it's gas burning. And if I go to swap that out for an electric vehicle, it's electric for a reason, and it's going to require 2.5 times more copper, approximately. It may or may not use nickel. We are seeing a transition away from nickel being used in just regular passenger vehicles. but it's going to have other metals in it, like manganese, that my car currently doesn't have much of. And so it's not just about generating the electricity. It's not just about transmission of the electricity. It's about our vehicles that we rely on, especially in rural areas like this. Dominic, I appreciate your bus service, but many people still have cars. And your buses are going electric, isn't that true? So, well, as a lot of our personal vehicles probably won't use nickel, things like buses will, because they are heavier duty, longer vehicle distances, and they all require metals. And the problem with this swap out is that one lonesome hand, maybe two that had electric vehicles, when you go to replace your batteries, and they hopefully get recycled, because it's an insult to the earth if they aren't, you're just going to replace your own battery back into your own vehicle. You're not helping me get a battery in mine. And that's what's tough. And that's why you hear people say that the amount of copper that needs to be mined is, in the next 25 years, is the same amount of copper we have mined since the dawn of time. To which we have to start asking ourselves about why and what are we willing to start sacrificing as far as consumer use? Because we are driving the demand. You know, everybody came today to hear about, in theory, the supply chain, the supply. And we talk a lot about supply of metals because we talk about mining on the Iron Range. We talk about mining the Duluth complex. I don't see enough conversations being held about the demand. Why is there even a push to mine? Why are we having this conversation? Who's wanting these metals? What are they wanting them for? What are they willing to pay for them? We have to talk about recycling. You know, I'm the era where people, for the most part, my generation and younger, we recycle with really good intentions, particularly aluminum cans. Raise your hand if you've ever worked at a mine. Holy cats. So for those of you that worked at a mine, you know it's 24/7. You know that you are going to work in conditions where other people are tucked away sleeping in bed. It's 40 below, or even worse, it's 90 and 170% humidity. You know that there are hundreds of people involved in bringing up that resource. You know, further downstream in processing of that resource, there's hundreds, if not thousands of people involved in making something. When we don't recycle metals, we have insulted every single person that ever put their hand on that metal. We have insulted the earth because we have cut her open, took something, and then just threw it back in. We have to get serious about recycling, which means we have to get serious about manufacturers and our ability to actually recycle stuff. I'm sure all of you at some point have owned something that you turned in with good intent to hope it gets recycled, and maybe it never does. Because recycling things can be tough. Recycling also takes a lot of tough conversations about the fact that it's not easy. And it requires a lot of complicated metallurgy. And it requires a lot of energy use. But we're only in 2025. I like to think humans are going to be around for a little while longer. If we know that globally, we've already tapped out most of the high-grade, high-concentration metals, and we're using low-grade now, that should probably be a wake-up call to us that we have to get serious about recycling. Because it's only 2025. And because it's not just about us here in the US. And that's the thing that I wrestle with the most, is realizing my quality of life is what other people around the globe want. But my quality of life is only what it is because I have lived in a nation with affordable energy and all the goods and services I could ever hope for. Once again, I'm going to remind folks that we are a nonpartisan organization, so I do not want to get into conversations about certain things right now, other than to say, building out clean energy to protect people and the planet means that when we obtain the materials to provide clean energy, they have to be obtained in a way that protects the people and the planet. Otherwise, it's all for naught. You know, we talk about greenwashing, and the mining industry always gets accused of greenwashing. We have to make sure we're not greenwashing other stuff too, and feeling good about things that maybe we shouldn't feel good about. We should know where those solar panels that go up are constructed. We should know if the materials within those solar panels have ever been blockaded from coming to the US because they were built with slave labor in China. We should know where our metals come from that are in our wind turbines. Because part of the reason we're having a conversation today is because in the US, we do believe in having the conversation. One of the reasons I went into the mining industry, even though I really did not plan to, was that at some point I recognized that I was part of the problem. Because I drive a car. I live in a house. I use electricity. Unlike my husband, I do shut off the lights. But I benefit. We collectively benefit. We're in this building today because of mining. Because running behind all those walls is copper. And so I wanted to be a part of something that did make me bristle a little. Because I knew it could be done differently than it had been. I knew it had to be done differently than it had been. Water is not meant to be the color of my hair. It's not. And that is always a risk. And so in the US and Minnesota, we have environmental regulations because of what hasn't been done well in the past. In mining, we have Safety and Health Act, MSHA. Those of you miners who raise your hand, I won't put you through the trauma of going through MSHA training for a full day here, but safety regulations are written in the blood of workers. Environmental regulations are written in the blood of communities. Environmental regulations aren't just about protecting the bugs and bunnies, as some people say. It's about protecting community health, downstream health. Bugs and bunnies will absolutely, but it's bigger than that. It's about us as people. And in the US, we saw what happens when you don't regulate companies, when you don't hold companies accountable. And so when people bring their concerns to me about mining, I'm glad they are. Because we should be concerned and we should be asking, because every cut onto the earth is a cut. For the carpenters in this room, measure twice, cut once, right? When I had shoulder surgery, the surgeon met with me beforehand and he said, "So which shoulder are we operating on?" And I said, "I really thought you would know." But he had to sign my shoulder. I had to say it in my left shoulder and he had to sign it. And in mining, that's the care we need to always have. Measure twice, cut once. We don't want environmental reviews going faster. We want people to be engaged. We want things done well. And we know what well looks like. We want people to question. That's a healthy society. We also want a just energy transition. We built this nation on the backs of people with limited ability to say no. Most of the critical minerals in our country reside fairly close to tribal nations, including ours. And historically, there was no care or concern. We just built. We built railroads. We built highways. We cut communities apart. And if we're going to do this energy transition because we care about people on the planet, we can't not care about the people. You know, when I started in the mining industry 20 some years ago, there was no discussion of tribal nations at all. It just wasn't. And I've watched that transition happen over the last 20 years, and not just in mining, but just everywhere. And it's grossly overdue. And there's going to be friction because we're figuring it out for the first time. There's no playbook on how to rectify hundreds of years of, fill in the word you want. We're going to have challenges navigating that because we're humans. And it's not just mining that's dealing with it, it's communities, it's neighborhoods, it's state governments, federal governments. And we're just people having to figure out a new way to talk about things. I live in the 1855 treaty territory. 20 years ago, I wouldn't have known that. No, I'm inside Lake. I'm in 1855. So you all are in 1854. And I know I'm not in 1854 because to drive here, I drive past a sign that tells me I'm entering the 1854 treaty territory. 20 years ago, we wouldn't have cared. We wouldn't even have thought of what that meant. When one of our mining projects was recently asked by Boyce Fort to change the name of their project, they did. It's not the Mesaba deposit anymore. It's the Sunrise deposit. They worked with Boyce Fort on that. 20 years ago, I don't know that the mining company would have taken that seriously. 20 years ago, I don't know that our communities would have. When you know better, you do better. So as we look through this transition, these are all the regulatory agencies, and I won't make you go through all of them. But the other part of that just energy transition is who is building this out for us. I love Appalachia. I love West Virginia. I love Kentucky. I love that region of our country. And I see a lot of similarities to the Iron Range. Those coal miners worked really hard jobs so that all of us could just flip on a light switch without caring about it. And we mock them and we make fun of them, right? We make fun of people in these poor communities in Appalachia. They talk funny, they look funny. They're poor. They did their work for us. So as we look at this just energy transition, who are we asking to do the mining so that you can just flip on a light switch? When you flip on your light switch, do you ever think about who did that? So who did the work so that you could? Do you even see those people? My husband's worked over 10 years at the mine. I've watched him work shift work. I've watched him come home tired after night shift. I've watched him work multiple night shifts in a row where at some point he's just tired. When we build this out and we think about building mines, are we taking care of those people who are doing that work for us? I don't have great answers because it's hard. I do know that we have resources here in Minnesota. I do know that I would rather they were in Kansas because then no one would care. They'd probably already be dug up. I love picking on Kansas. My apologies. When Grant Hoschild recently picked on Kansas, I had to laugh because I was like, same. It's hard. If we could go back 1 billion years, we would never put these deposits in 3 of the most amazing watersheds. because it's not just about boundary waters. It's also about Lake Superior. It's also about the upper Mississippi. But it's just about any watershed, because it kind of implies that we don't care about other watersheds, and I know we do. I know we do. But this one is very noticeable. It's the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. It is amazing. People come here and have spiritual awakenings. That doesn't happen in Kansas. I don't think so. I feel like I'm gonna get an angry email afterwards and be like, you know, when I was in Topeka, but it's true. These conversations should be tough. We can't go back a billion years, which means we have to start today. It means we might actually have to just learn about things that we otherwise wouldn't have to learn about because we would just use the products. I will never need to know where this cotton came from in my jeans. I just don't. I don't have to know. I should. I should probably care. My ask is that we think about these projects from a bigger scale. And we recognize that Minnesota, we haven't asked to not keep getting these medals. We have actually asked for more of them by committing to 100% clean energy. That's a sign as you come into Minnesota once you've escaped Kansas. And we are going to continue to have trucks go past that on I-35, I-90. What's the other ones? I'm a northerner. I'm like, what else comes in from the south? 94? I don't know. Everything to me is I-35. At what point do we send stuff past the backside of that? That's my question. My other question is, are we willing to have conversations where we learn about the projects? You know, today, I'm not going to talk about Twin Metals specifically because I don't work for Twin, but I did, and I loved it. And in that 1 year as their director of water resources, nobody ever asked me about the water. And as a nerd and as a scientist, all I wanted to do was explain things like isostatic rebound. And nobody cared. And that sucks because we had a chance to educate. And there are folks from Twin here today that are willing to educate. They didn't choose for that deposit to be here either. So yeah. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank everyone for caring enough to show up. It's very rare that people show up. I know many of you saw me on the schedule and went, oh, I don't want to hear what she has to say, but you still showed up. So please keep showing up, and thank you for your time today. Oh, I burst
14 minutes.
Sorry, did I go over?
No,
Okay.
you did not go over.
Well, I won't demand 45 minutes. Thank you very much for coming. I'm interested in your call for a conversation, which is both local and global. For our local conversation, the watershed of the Boundary Waters, Quetico, and Voyagers, that's not a new conversation. I think you know that. For the last 9 years, since 2016, the Forest Service has said no to mining in this place, in the watershed of the Boundary Waters, because it's too risky. And once the Boundary Waters is polluted, you can't fix it, can't mitigate it. Over the course of the time, from 2016 to 2023, we've had 8 public hearings throughout the state of Minnesota on mining in the watershed of the Boundary Waters. We've had 454 days of comment period. And we've had almost 675,000 Americans submit written comments opposing mining in the watershed of the Boundary For us, it's more than the water. Water's important. But this is one of the most precious landscapes in the country. Boreal forest, wildlife, clean water, the heart of our regional economy, who we are as a people, etc. And we've said no, and now it's protected. And I would respectfully ask Antofagasta to go back to Chile. We don't want copper mining in the headwaters of the boundary waters. It's the wrong place. Now you might say, well, we need these metals, right, Julie? We need these metals for our energy transition. But turns out there's very little in the way of metals in the watershed of the boundary waters. If Twin Metals were to build its mine, it would supply 2.3% of the nation's demand for copper in a year. So we give up the boundary waters for less than 2.3% copper. It's 1.5% cobalt, a little more for nickel. And what would happen to those metal concentrates? Well, Twin Metals in its mine plan said it was going to ship it to the nearest port of entry. Antofagasta smelts its metals in low-cost smelters in China, where it's put into products that we buy back. So when you say, where do those solar panels come from China, they're not from the US. So it's insignificant and irrelevant. There is no compelling reason for us to develop copper mines in the watershed of the boundary waters. But let's think globally, because you raised the energy transition, which is critically important to address, okay, I gotta hurry up, the climate and extinction crisis. What we have here addresses it through resilience, through carbon sequestration, through migratory pathways, through resilience. And our smart answer, in addition to e-waste, recycling, and you are spot on that, the latest report says if we did the e-waste, we would save the country from developing 8 copper mines, so all in on recycling. But what we have here is more important to addressing the crisis than destroying our landscape, degrading our waters for a minuscule amount of copper, nickel, and platinum and palladium. Sorry.
Was there a question to that? I'm
Yeah.
not sure. Was there a question?
Are you seeking any response from Julie?
No.
Well, I'm gonna respond regardless. So you say the Forest Service had their science that they've said it can't be done well. I will respectfully disagree, and my apologies to Twin, but I did work for you. And the work we did as baseline environmental studies was not ever looked at. And as a scientist, I did not want this job. I never wanted this job. I didn't want to have an advocacy job. But when my water team took years of data and good faith efforts, and we were not granted the opportunity to share that data, and you never visited me in the Twin office, you've never talked to me, you've never met with me. It broke my heart as a scientist to see that people were assuming harm without ever looking at the data that we had created in good faith and the modeling we had done in good faith. And there was an assumed harm that was not site specific. It was not based on the groundwater research we had done. And so no, no, Becky, no, you can't. But you're not, I just want folks to understand that it's not settled science.
Mr.
And, oh, yep, Bob, oh, Bob.
Yesterday, I received notice that Talon Metals is going to have their annual corporate meeting. And it's going to be in Barbados. And, you know, I don't know where Barbados is, but I don't think I can go there in my motorhome. And so my question is, here we've got a penny stock, and I believe it's little more than a post office box in Barbados. Why should we sacrifice our wetlands for another corporate adventure?
Yeah, you won't be able to drive your RV to see them like you were able to go up to British Columbia with it. That is true. I actually don't really know where, I know Barbados is in the Caribbean, that's about it. It's a good question, Bob. Because because we're the ones who want these products. Americans are the biggest consumers in this world. We almost single-handedly cause climate change. And yet when it comes to creating the solutions, which involve renewable energy and God forbid conservation, poor Jimmy Carter trying to get us to wear sweaters, we don't want to do that. Our wetlands are more important than other people's wetlands. Our land is more important than other people's. There is no someplace else. And back to the processing, yep, I would love to see us create hydromets or even pyrometallurgical processing in the US. But that's also going to come at an impact. It's going to mean a building is built. It's going to mean we have to have conversations about metallurgical engineering. And one of the places that the US really has failed on is that China graduates 3,000 mining engineers a year. We graduate 300, and they don't have 10 times our population. China had the strategic foresight to realize humans are going to keep wanting stuff. And we're going to figure out how to provide it. And the US dropped the ball. And we didn't encourage people to go into mining engineering. We told people mining is the devil. Whatever you do, don't work in mining. But also never say no to anything. And now we live in a world where we are almost fully dependent on others for that stuff. It's a good question you raised, Bob.
Well,
And you have always cared about the earth in the 20 years I've been in this industry. And I respect that about you.
I don't want to start to be for other people, but when my wife and I went to the Reno conference where you go regularly, and one time we went home my way to the southern route, they were for a couple of weeks. We went through Ajo, Arizona, and we studied a little mining history there, and they shut down their mine during a labor unrest. They just left it shut down many years now. And as I recall, you might know if I'm wrong or not, but as I recall, their ore body, their remaining ore body is more than 1%. Ajo is already a sacrifice zone. I don't think we should open up our wetlands before we go back and look at that Ajo, Arizona ore body.
And I don't know enough about the Ajo ore body. And yeah, it was a surprise to see you at Reno this year. I was like, wait a minute, there's a Minnesotan. Kind of blanked out on what I was gonna think in there.
Can I insert a thought?
Yeah.
Yeah, last year we hosted Ernest Scheider, author of a book called The War Below. And to your remarks about our consumerism, my critique of that book was that it did, and no project can be complete, but the book didn't have capacity to include an analysis of who's leading the conversation about how we can consume less. And I do find there's a total dearth of that in our culture and in our world. And so one question I have for you is there anywhere you look where those conversations are being had?
No, that's the hard thing is there's, for folks that lead that conversation, you have to probably create an organization. That's not something you can easily get funding to do. We're going to talk to people about how to use less stuff. So I don't see groups leading that. I try to introduce that a lot because I want people to recognize their lives. And because it is something that living on the range, and when I used to have student groups come through HibTac on tours, and they would say, oh my God, this is a big hole in the ground, or there's this, and I'm like, every time you trade in your cell phone, there's 40 some holes in the ground to build your new one. Maybe you don't need the latest cell phone. You know, a lot of conversations I see are now centered on AI and data centers.
I'm going to jump in so we can get more
Yeah.
questions going. I'm going to just make one more plug. The book, also one of the most revealing things to me was learning about the decisions made at the federal government level in the 70s and 80s to strategically move away from having the United States be a place where mining was prioritized. And that was a move that was made, you know, in multiple administrations over decades by design. And we're that, yep, we have a question over here.
Thank you for the opportunity to bring up the point that all of your statistical evidence was not available or not accepted. Along that line, how often do mining companies or the state test the watersheds and the lakes for all of the various nefarious metals and like sulfur and mercury and lead? How often are the waters tested?
By the mining companies or by the, like, do you mean just specific where mining projects are?
Right.
It really is permit dependent. So all the different taconite mines and then any of the proposed mines, you have what's called an NPDES permit. And within that permit are different monitoring guidelines that are created when you get your permit. And so that's what dictates how many samples you have to take and what you have to sample for.
And a real quick follow-up. And what has been the result over the years? Are we below minimum standards or above minimum standards?
If you're speaking specifically about the taconite mines, I'd have to look at the data for all of those. You know, in the couple decades here, it's been interesting to watch them evolve. You know, in the beginning, nobody talked about sulfate. When I started in this career, nobody talked about sulfate. And now that's a big thing. And we're paying attention to it. So a lot of the permits are having to actually look at that. I think down the road, we probably identify other things that we have to monitor for that we aren't currently. So it's definitely something that is evolving over time. And we do see concerns that we may not have even known we needed to be concerned about before. But those are all really mining company specific. So I won't go into that because I just don't know their data.
I have a relatively related question. It seems like the legislature struggles with trying to establish standards that are as favorable to mining as possible and still acknowledge the environmental concerns. Once they get those standards set, however, enforcement is a whole nother issue. Is there anything we can do other than, you know, contacting our legislators to see that enforcement happens?
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I went through enforcement actions at the mine I was at. We had dissolved iron exceedances, which seems ironic at an iron mine, but so we did have enforcement actions on that. The sulfate one is probably what you're thinking about, and that is a entire talk that could be a good Tuesday group talk, to be blunt. But enforcement, I've gone through them myself when I was at a company, so I know they are willing to do enforcement, but sulfate is a lot hairier, and that might be a good Tuesday group talk someday.
Well, and then I've got two questions queued up before we wrap, but speaking of future Tuesday groups, quickly, next week will be a Meet New Eliites program, and I hope this room is just as full so we can meet our new neighbors. After that, we're going to be hearing from an artist about their proposal for how to do economics differently for artists. And then after that, it will be a presentation by Becky and Ingrid on an update with the campaign to save the boundary water. So if you're particularly interested in that exchange, the conversation will continue.
Thanks for being here. Could you enlighten us a little bit on the amazing qualities of water and
We don't have that much time.
I know, and gravity and how that relationship is with copper and sulfur and those things? Just
Oh, I think so.
Yeah.
So the big thing that comes up with water and copper mining, I think what you're getting at is probably acid rock drainage, maybe, or just general.
I think water is such a basic thing. So many
without clean water, we don't live. And what made me go into water was the fact that water is not just the tangible. It's not just what we drink. It's not just what we're mostly made up of, but it's the fact that there's research that's been done that shows that people's stress level drops when they can see water. And there's the fact that you do see people go to the boundary waters and have their entire lives change from that experience. And I think sometimes for those of us who've grown up in the 218, it's just always been part of our lives, and we don't always fully appreciate. Going to big cities is good for me because I go to New York City and I think, oh my God, if I was to come to the boundary waters or just northern Minnesota, the silence would probably make me twitch. Sincerely, it goes beyond just the physical properties or even just that it's needed for physical life. It transcends all of that.
I will try to keep this succinct, but I appreciate you acknowledging environmental concerns, concerns about overconsumption and consumerism, resource tracing of the things that we use and recycling. But some of the conversations I've seen more nationally have been talking about mining domestically and keeping things in the US. But I feel like there's a gap around talking about like smelter and smelter capacity in the US. So I'm wondering if you could kind of touch on that both at a national level or Minnesota, since you're more Minnesota specific, and then kind of the environmental concern for that.
So right now the US has 2 copper smelters. So there's Arizona and Utah. And so Eagle Mine in Michigan sends their stuff up to Sudbury. And there is concern it would get sent to China. So when I participate in national conversations, the number one thing I hear, and I heard this at the conference last week in New York, is that what does it take to get companies willing to invest in smelting capacity in the US? Because they're ungodly expensive and they're super energy dependent. And so that goes back to that where we have to talk about the supply chain isn't just about the mines, it's about the processing, and it's about even the next step in. And those aren't easy conversations either because they are really energy dependent and there's different technologies you can use, but to build something to support Minnesota, you would never build a smelter just for one of the projects. The math wouldn't math. But if the country is serious about domestic production of minerals, that is the next step. And I am hearing it from National Mining Association and other, Bob goes to the American Exploration and Mining Association conference, which is awesome that he's coming out to learn about it. But it's those organizations that are driving that conversation on a federal level of, is it really domestic if we're only mining it here? Like we need to be processing it too, but getting people willing to invest in that is a challenge too. And the environmental. Going into a store and buying something is such a tiny sliver of the supply chain. And I just saw a bunch of pollen fly past you and my nose just stuffed up looking at it. But that is the next step. Otherwise, yeah.
I would like to reiterate my very sincere and earnest invitation for y'all to continue attending Tuesday group. We meet every single week, most typically here at the Grand Daily Lodge. The program starts at the noon hour. Check out boundarywatersconnect.com to sign up for the weekly emails about what the program will be. And again, just remember that perhaps everyone in this room wants to come back. The conversation will certainly continue. Thank you, Julie.